Good morning, public history students. It is Tuesday, January 16th. I hope you are doing well, keeping warm. As you probably know, today, Portland State is closed due to the storm warning and weather watch that's in place right now. So what I decided to do was record some remarks on this week's reading. We only meet once a week, obviously, so our time is precious and limited together. And so hopefully this will support your learning, help you write your good first paper that's due tonight at midnight, and just keep the flow going, albeit in a one-way street a little bit today over this recording. So you'll be able to see this full video with slides in Canvas. I'll also upload the audio only if you like to listen to things. We're told on campus that students, significant number of students access their Canvas accounts through their phones. So maybe you like listening to things. And I'll also upload the slides separately so you can take your time with those if that's a good way for you to learn and review the material. So I'm going to do a quick share screen and proceed with some remarks this morning. Okay, so I hope you can see this. Here we are, Democratic Arts of Mourning, week 2. And I'm on my laptop, so forgive me if I struggle a little bit with making the slides go. So here's our overview. We're going to do a little housekeeping first. Then I'm going to talk about the general frameworks for the course, which hopefully are surfacing as you contemplate the syllabus and as you go through the reading and structure of how things are organized. Then I want to offer some remarks about our central question this term, which has to do with what do we mean by the democratic in the context of grief and mourning in the United States. And then I'm going to just walk us through a little bit of the reading. I'm going to review the Greek antecedents that are highlighted in the Democratic Arts anthology. I'll talk about the Civil War in Drew Faust's writing. And then I'm going to review the 2 articles, only grad students had to read both, about 9/11. And just kind of highlight, some things I want you to keep in mind as you put together your own questions about this material. And then I'll wrap up with some encouragements for writing the first paper. Okay, so under housekeeping, you can see in the slide, and I will also ping y'all out in the Google verse, to sign up for discussion starters. So there's now 5 members of our class. So welcome to Celeste, our newest member. So I'd like you to sign up to help launch discussion on a particular week. And so you'll see that. So please respond. We're going to need someone for next Tuesday, God willing, the weather will let us get back together. And so that's the first item of housekeeping. And then the second item of housekeeping has to do with your free writes. So I just want to move to a quick review of what you shared out from our class last week. So just first up is our learning goals. I thought these were really interesting. Most of my academic career, one student wrote, has been very individualized. I'm looking forward to strengthening my teamwork skills and working with peers and professors. So yay, public history is a very collaborative field. And though our seminar is a little bit more traditional, we are definitely going to keep an eye on both the collaborations that we're seeing historically in memorialization processes, right? And grieving, like what does collaboration look like at these moments in the past? And then of course, we're going to look to the present. We're going to have a couple of special presentations that allow us to think about that as well. Another learning goal, relating my knowledge and critical thinking aloud and through my writing that in a way that showcases my learning to its fullest extent. This is a great learning goal. It's a lifelong learning goal, not just from my experience, not just a course specific one, which is like, you've got a lot going on up here. How do we express it verbally and in writing in ways that matches, right? That does justice to our thinking, and often our thinking is ahead of our reading and of our writing and speaking skills. And often our speaking skills are ahead of our writing skills. So it's just practice, 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 and I celebrate this goal because it is what I share. Another learning goal: express myself and my ideas more fluently. I think this is, of course, a wonderful goal. We have to perform a lot in this world, and the squeaky wheels get the grease. And, you know, it's really important to keep up with, for humanities folk like us, to keep up with the very fast moving forms of communication that are out there, and so that we can be fully in the swim and not left out of the flow, so to speak. And another learning goal, I would like to improve my writing skills. So these are all great, and I think this will be a course that hopefully will support each of these well, but we will keep checking in to make sure, as the needle moves, as your needs move and change, that we make some adjustments to make sure you're heading in the right direction. So then I asked for some reflection remarks from you all on your experiences with collaboration. I mean, like, it's such a big word. What does it even mean? So I just thought I would assess the room and see what you all had to make of that. So on the academic side, in writing for the Pacific Sentinel, which I believe is PSU publication, magazine publication, I collaborate with the editor and found it rewarding, demonstrative of how hopeless I'd find myself without a helpful academic environment, right? Despite the privileging of single authorship within academia, especially in the humanities, almost nobody gets anything done alone. I mean, functionally nobody. And so we want to examine that. Like, what does that look like? And why is it so rarely articulated and acknowledged and brought forward and supported? So that's great. Second, breaking the ice with a group of students is a crucial first step to collaboration. It leads to a space in which participants will feel respected. So again, we have to get to know each other. You know, it's like kind of interesting thing, you know, throw 6 strangers in a room and hope they can learn together. Well, we're gonna have to work at it a little. So the idea of breaking the ice and getting to know one another, I think, is good recommendation. So we will put something in place for that, I think. Another collaborative moment, writing groups in graduate courses has opened me up to a variety of perspectives, and I enjoyed the critics of my own viewpoints. This is wonderfully positive reflection back on collaboration. But, you know, this idea that performance is scary, but sharing can be rich and rewarding. I mean, performing is a form of sharing. But that if we build in certain kinds of structured collaboration, that can yield some good learning. Collaboration as peers to set our reading and discussion agenda was more inclusive and helpful. This was one I had a little trouble reading, but this idea that that students have a stake in what we're doing in the classroom and want to have some choices available to them to make their intellectual needs known. And we have that in a few places in the course, and I'm very open to hearing where there might be some more places that might be meaningful and helpful. And so just for fun, I asked for people for non-academic collaboration, again, thinking that, well, advanced humanities students are probably likely, you know, been working in silos. So particularly with COVID, you know, there's sort of, we have these, like, you know, different legacies of how we navigated that. So I thought, well, maybe in the non-academic side, people were more collaborative. I mean, certainly during COVID, some people who testified and behaved in much more collaborative ways, like in neighborhoods and helping each other out, and sort of brought people together rather than isolated them. It's a very complicated, you know, rich set of experiences, hard to generalize. So people were all over the map, which I think is also really good, really instructive. So one person said they couldn't think of any non-academic collaboration. So that's really important. This is new territory. An experience with non-academic collaboration, being able to use one's strength to boost others' weaknesses, I think put a typo in there, is key to successful collaboration. So that is a non-competitive model, this idea that by sharing and bolstering one another, there's a more powerful whole. So that's a great reminder. Another non-academic collaboration with my roommate, we practice techniques of proper collaboration, working together to come to procedures that we're both comfortable with, and this level of communication allows for a better living environment. So I think it's great. You know, sometimes having those meetings or check-ins feels a little, I'll just speak for myself. Sometimes it might feel a little like, oh, not again, or a little tedious, but it always pays off. So I myself have a little bit of resistance sometimes to collaboration. In fact, I've been trying to say more out loud that kind of just for intellectual exercise. I don't like collaboration. I mean, I do, but I don't have a love-hate relationship with collaboration. I think it's just my temperament. But it's always better when we check in and we communicate, good communication. Finally, on the non-academic side, my recent collaboration with a friend and neighbor to raise our crazy carpool schedule for our children has been very successful, albeit a little crazy. So I love this sort of repeated word of crazy, those sort of chaotic, improvisational, catch as catch can nature of the world. But it's necessary. It's necessary to try to stay connected, given the unpredictability and the stressors of the world that we live in. And the many routines and calendars that we're responding to in our daily. So thank you for those reflections, and we'll fold those into our classroom process. My reflections on your free write. So I think students want a respectful environment where they feel seen and heard. That you can't have too much good communication, I think, even though it sounds like a contradiction, but you can't really have too much good communication. That maybe a sense of humor and humility is good to foster learning and listening. Most folks, I think, need that personal communication or personal connection to build trust in a working and learning environment, and that it's okay to need help and make mistakes. That there's difference between sharing and performing, although there's a little, it's not a tight or not two hermetically sealed categories, but we have to share our mistakes as well as our triumphs in order to learn and grow. So those are just sort of some of my reflections on your free writes. So we can wait to see what y'all think of those as some takeaways. So think on that. And that's, I think, brings us out of housekeeping and into the frameworks section of my remarks this morning. So this is me kind of surfacing some of the general premises, some of the general features, if you will, of the material in our course. And it's not to lay down the law or something like that, but rather to identify some of its limits, as well, I think, as some of its strengths, and to open those up for elaboration, challenge. This is a new class. This is the first time I've taught it. And so I'm learning too. This is a learning adventure for me too. Even though I've sort of been working in this field for decades, there's always something new. So as it stands for the moment, most of the material we're looking at this term comes from a kind of Western perspective, and it will draw heavily on what's in the Western Academy is called the classics, primarily ancient Greece, and Christian, mostly Protestant traditions. So when we're talking about grief and mourning, we're talking about fairly intimate cultural traditions, and those are the two that are heavily represented in the reading. And we'll try not to make this exclusive. And I want to welcome people to challenge and enrich and embroider and, develop non-classical, non-Christian oriented projects and themes. But if you Google the library, there's a heavy focus on these as in terms of what's sort of at our fingertips to draw on. I think another premise of this course, and it's kind of an anthropological statement, that the idea that death in this more or less Western frame is a space or moment of rupture that invites or even demands active meaning making. Now, that is a very culturally specific take on death. There are many takes on death in the world and around the globe in human experience. But the ones that we're going to be focusing on as a launching point, as a starting point, is this idea that death is rupture, is a kind of break point that into which this space generally flows language. It's a narrativization moment. Okay. And following, elaborating on this idea, what do you mean death is a space? Well, death tends to be articulated like so much in the Western tradition in terms of a binary construct. Okay, so life is opposed to death. The living are starkly distinct from the dead. This is very culturally specific. This is not universal by a long shot. And there are other binaries, constructions of knowledge, constructions of meaning that we're going to bump into a lot that are like super Western. This is the idea of purity and impurity, the notion of order and disorder, and you can just keep on going. Male, female, day, night. I mean, salvation, damnation. We're working primarily, the readings are working primarily in a universe, in a worldview that is very binaristic in its construction of meaning. Okay, so that's just something to notice and challenge, when appropriate, when you're able. Another premise of our materials is the idea that death, grief, and mourning are situated, are tied to place. Okay. And that place is central to asking questions about human meaning making around death, burial, and memorialization. I've called this week's reading Over Here as a kind of counterpoint to, we're looking at World War I next week, which there's a famous song called Over There, which we'll listen to. So it's place-based. It's a form of knowledge that is place-based. And some of you may be coming up with projects that are less place-based, or maybe place needs to be unpacked and it critically examined. And I would say yes. I mean, I can tell you that, for example, in the 1400s, there were many Christian kings and queens of England whose bodies were actually had their internal organs, especially their hearts, planted in different places. And that they would be entombed in one locale, but that their heart was planted usually in an urn, not planted, but sort of preserved, put in a mausoleum in another places. So doesn't mean, just because it's place-based doesn't mean it's one place. And of course, we have memorials to events that are place-specific all over the world. I mean, to me, the European Holocaust of the Jews comes to mind. There are Holocaust memorials all over the world, even though it was somewhat of a place-based event. So we want to pay attention to situatedness. We want to pay attention to place, but it's not going to be easy because place seems to be fixed. But then again, just when you think it's fixed, it can move. So related to situatedness is that place making, that a locale is not a place. It takes active human activity to turn a locale, a point on the map, into a place that has meaning. It's often around sacralization. And here we are again drawing on anthropological concepts. And I have a wonderful quote here from a scholar I love who says, "Emplacement is fundamentally a relationship to and toward death. And death is a source of power in place." It's very, very interesting, right? So that people just think archetypally about war, defend perhaps a sense of territory of not just any old place, but a specific place, right? And where people are buried has a lot to do with which locales become places, which locales are considered sacred spaces. Again, this is culturally specific, though, just common enough, I think, to bear some comparison. But again, not every group of humans shares this, and I want to be sensitive to that and welcome alternative views. And so a final premise from the course, and also I think comes out very, very clearly in the reading this week, is that mourning and the marking of death is sort of personal and emotional and very culturally specific, yet hardly immune from the political. So what I mean by the political is that power relations, right? Whether those are class-based, international, family and gender and sexuality based. There are many, many axes in which power moves, right? And death, mourning, and memorialization, of course, have a very personal and seemingly apolitical dimension. And yet in context, these moments are hardly immune from the political. We can find the fingerprints of the political in many, many different ways. So those are some of the premises. Those are some of the intellectual premises of the course. Again, they're not rules. They're there to, to sort of guide and serve as jumping off points, but it's just a reminder of like, this is the pool we're swimming in a lot. So if you want to dive out or dive in and out, just want to be, we just want to be able to talk about where we're going and where we're coming from. So there you go. And similarly, I wanted to try to surface some nuggets, right, about what we mean when we seek out the democratic in the domain of death, mourning, and memorialization. So building off my last point, I think the reading is in agreement. It shares the assumption, shares the premise, right, that mourning is fundamentally political in the sense that a collectivity is implicated, right? And that an operation of power is involved in deeming a body grievable. Okay, that mourning is both public and private, and it looks forward and backwards in time. So it's also it's ambivalent. It's not just one thing. That's crucial. Even though I'm saying that we're kind of swimming in the Western stew pot, it's still unstable and it's still ambivalent and doesn't stand still. So while it might be a cliche that a funeral is not the time or place for politics, in practice, and especially in wartime, we're going to focus quite a bit on war. This term, active meaning making, is necessary for grief to unfold. Otherwise, meaning and community collapses. So there's no pure space for death to operate outside of community. Sort of like the cliche, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, did it really fall, right? So the only way human loss of life has meaning is insofar as the living give it meaning. At least that's what you're responsible in this class. Someone dying, a death, can have all kinds of meanings, but the ones that you're responsible for in this class as historians have to do with how communities make sense out of that death. So for these kinds of reasons, for these kinds of premises, based on these kinds of premises, the contributors to the democratic arts of mourning proceed from the idea that political theory begins with loss. This is a somewhat highfalutin claim for the discipline. And again, this is not a rule. This is just like, this is a premise. What do you think of that? But in the sense, it's like we have some explaining to do. In other words, the human condition is, and this is pretty Western, is a kind of broken condition that that loss is sort of the one thing everybody has in common. And so humans have some explaining to do because it all seems, death is of course constructed as the ultimate mystery in the Western frame. And so this idea that political theory begins with loss is kind of an interesting way to position the scholarly piece of the puzzle. So I'm interested what you think about that. So particularly in the anthology, these writers are pulling threads through, in terms of political theory, from the founders of the United States and their understanding of ancient democracy in Greece. So that's the Western part of that anthology. It's like, think of carding wool. It's looking again at classical literature, seeing how it gets kind of filtered through some of the constructions of American democracy and how that shows up in the world. And the two features of death and mourning and grief that and memorialization that tend to show up really come out of the ancient world. One is the eulogy, the words spoken at the time of a death, which the roots of which mean the good word, and tragedy. And both the eulogy and the tragedy were pillars of public pedagogy and communal self-understanding. So how did ancient Athens know itself? Well, one of the ways we have of perceiving their self-understanding is by looking at eulogies and tragedies. Now, of course, those are some of the main things that survived these many hundreds, thousands of years. So we have a sort of biased sample, if you will, but nonetheless reliable, I think. And so we want to attend to the ways in which the United States and particularly the first century of folk, were very attentive to these social forms as ways of inventing and enacting a democracy. So those are, I think, important things to just sort of notice in the reading. I think the other thing about the anthology is that their observation, these scholars' observation, and we may agree or disagree. I'm inclined to agree, at least on week 2, is that authentic mourning for any community is difficult work, past and present. And it's often avoided, commodified, denied, deferred, or it results in scapegoating. So we're not just dealing with sort of ideal types from the ancient past or the sort of flowery aspirations of privileged few, but we're trying to dig down and see how behaviors around death, grief, mourning, and memorialization play out, and humans being fallible and power dynamics being what they are. There's not always this sort of ideal reckoning with the self, with the community, and with our democratic aspirations as there might be. In fact, sometimes other things happen that are less than supportive of democratic and inclusive political life. So I just want to say that I think in the US context, the more recent US context, and I think we can draw this back to some extent to earlier centuries, but I definitely feel for the last 50 years or so that I think, to speak in somewhat generalities, that African American life and loss are assigned a particular form of labor in the construction of US democracy, and that sort of Black death and life are vested with this idea of hope, that the Black experience becomes the kind of proof text of the democratic experiment. And I have two just tiny gestures to support this claim. It is by no means unique to me, but Cornel West's theologian and philosopher recent book, Hope on a Tightrope, from 2008. Actually, these come at the same moment, which I think is kind of puts a little exclamation point on thing I'm trying to say here. And then Shepard Fairey's poster supporting Barack Obama's presidential bid in 2008. And so, again, we want to just interrogate what the rich language around death, burial, and mourning. And one of the things about mourning and saying goodbye to someone, whether they were a hugely empowered individual or not, is that the living have to think about the future. They have to go on. And so hope is a word that often attaches to mourning and eulogizing. And so we want to just be attentive to what that really means and whose job it is in a democracy to perform and do the work of hope and aspiration. Okay. See if I can get the slide to move. Okay. So we have in our reading this week a good introduction to the Greek antecedents of death, around death, mourning, and memorialization that we're focusing on this term. Just get my power supply so I don't run out. And these you can find in many different kind of reference areas, but we're going to really our starting place is these three concepts of mourning: Homeric mourning, agonistic mourning, and democratic mourning. And you may say, those categories don't work for me. I don't find this discussion persuasive, and that is perfectly fine. I would be very curious I really wish we were together because I'd like to know what y'all think about it. I guess I'll have to just wait for your papers. But just very, very briefly, Homeric mourning is kind of this comes out of the ancient world, and it kind of short version is sort of like the hero worship version of mourning, which is consensus based, unquestioning, kind of utopian, aestheticized, romanticized, messianic, this idea that, you know, the people need a deliverer, and that a deliverer can redeem, you know, a fallen world or an imperfect world, and, you know, save or protect or, you know, fulfill the destiny of a particular population. And so that's a really important modality. And these are also not mutually exclusive. They can be a little bit mixed and matched. But I'm just laying them out as the reading does to just distill it for us. So I think you can see some of this Homeric tradition in the treatment of celebrities a little bit. People mentioned this last week. I think it's worth pursuing. And in contrast to Homeric mourning is this notion of agonistic mourning, you know, sort of agony, this sort of like tense, less utopian, less consensus-based cultural approach to marking a death. And it's also a little bit more impersonal. So it's not that a person deserves or earns this sort of outpouring of grief and recognition, but rather death makes certain requirements and demands on the community. And no matter who they are, this is how we mark this loss. And then it is very much a reckoning, a moment of discomfort and even struggle. So there might be just different valences, that there might be appreciation for the person, but yet, you know, a kind of critique or grievance, right? That it's not just, they weren't just great, but this tells us where our society needs to be improved or where we've gone wrong. And in that sense, democratic mourning is, I think, a little bit more of the agonistic mode. And indeed, what the anthology argues is very provocative, and I really am curious about what you come up with on this point, that democracy itself, if you will, is the practice of loss. So that mourning within a democracy has really special work to do in terms of building community, in terms of reckoning with inclusion, equality, liberty, etc. And they sort of propound in this formulation that to operate as one, to be a democracy, citizens are asked to die a little in order to merge with the whole. In other words, democracy is a contingent, even fugitive practice. It's difficult to do, right? It's difficult to do, since especially in the US context, democracy lies, you know, sort of bumps along next to heavy-handed individualism, in which everybody, you know, has a vote and has a voice, and is expected to be heard and listened to. And so, that is challenging, right? And so in democratic modes of mourning, there is this this sort of lack of closure, right? So that we sustain it's thought to sustain a space of defiant non-closure, or maybe defiant resignation is one of the sort of contradictory, paradoxical statements in the reading, which I thought was kind of interesting. You have to sustain discomfort in order for something new to emerge, in order for democracy to have time to happen, rather than covering it up with a lot of celebration or other kinds of speak, right, that are more about consensus or ideals and less about what we're actually doing in the everyday. So I commend these categories to you, not to, test you on them later, but I will be interested in what you think about them, and I hope you are able to reckon with them a little bit in the papers, both this week and going forward. And so the Schlosser article within the anthology treats a specific instance of mourning in the ancient world through the play Trojan Women, where complete mourning is denied, where mourning cannot happen, where there's a rupture, there's the destruction of Troy, and the people are bereft, are completely bereft. And I don't know about you, but when I was in high school, we were taught about Greek tragedy, and one of the things we were taught, and I don't think it's wrong, but I just want to remind us that that witnessing a tragedy or tragic plays or tragedy as a genre of literature sort of works because it allows a catharsis. It allows an emotional experience in the audience, and that is it allows people to both experience and then release their fears and griefs. And so this is the kind of thing that our reading is talking about when we refer to the politics of affect. Right? Mourning is personal, it's emotional, and who feels what tells us something about the political and social and economic context of the death, the society, the historical moment. So what Schlosser is showing us is, here's a Greek tragedy that doesn't permit catharsis, that doesn't let the audience off the hook, that doesn't allow for any kind of resolution, any kind of meaning. It's deferred meaning, right? When meaning is not clear, yet people have to go on. What is that? What is that? Meaning is not clear, yet people have to go on. Well, on one hand, it's life, but on the other hand, what else can we say about it? And so what this author says is that beyond the dominant Greek modes of tragedy, right? Homeric mourning, catharsis, etc. There's another space. And he argues that Trojan Women engenders, if you will, a holding environment in which mourning is disabled. And that this is very, very important because it allows the audience to sort of stay in a suspended state of reckoning. Who are we, right? Who are we and who can we be? What's next? If we don't have our rituals of mourning that are going to give us hope, right? That are going to give us the next generation. And so Schlosser contends that this form of tragedy confronts us with the limits of mourning and introduces a structure of feeling that makes visible the fragmented state of the collective. Okay. And perhaps you are reminded, I know that I am, of the upsurge led by Black Lives Matter, but not exclusively, after the killing of George Floyd in 2020. And it seems to me that the fragmented state of the collective was very much on display in the summer of 2020, especially in Portland, Oregon. And while I'm not sure there's any consensus about what it meant to display the fragmented state of the collective. In other words, that's just stage one of an analysis of where we are. I think we have in that and in many other areas, places where we can see this in contemporary. We don't have to go back to the Greeks necessarily. But it's helpful. It's helpful to see other models so that we can perhaps feel less lost. So Schlosser calls this state of suspension, this holding environment in which human interaction is stripped to its most basic sounds and gestures to a form. He calls it speaking a silence. And this is really good because I think we've touched on how silence is never blank. There's always something happening in a silence, and sometimes what's happening is the upending of meaning systems. And what does that sound like? How do we know it when we see it, for example? Since as scholars, we need to be able to sort of document and verify what we think we're seeing or hearing. Notice I'm going very sensory here, like, touch, hear, sight, how do we make evidentiary the breakdown of a meaning system? Well, here's one model, speaking of silence. So in terms of democratic practice, Schlosser suggests that solidarity, hope, and connection might emerge under conditions of unspeakable loss, under conditions in this holding environment. We are stripped down to the fundamentals. And he notes this need that calls the holding environment as connected to this human need for cradling at birth and death. So when we're at our most vulnerable, when we're at our most fragile, our most dependent, this is both a common ground and a kind of bookend to thinking about the life cycle, that it's very embodied and it's gendered, right? Trojan women. That doesn't mean there's no men on the stage. But as I suggested a few minutes ago, that the African-American experience is expected to perform certain work and certain labor in terms of embodying hope for democracy. So too are female bodies invested with certain labor, value, narrative burden. And so we want to identify where these dynamics show up, what they tell us, right, about what's happening in the evidence and in our contemporary society. So, grief, death, grief, mourning, and memorialization are cross-cut by, in the US context, by embodied, kind of racialized and gendered practices. They're all intersecting. And so we want to be very alert to how that shows up in the evidence and in the interpretations that we look at this term. So that's Schlosser for our Greek antecedents. And just moving on to Faust, who brings us fast forward in time, thousands of years, from ancient Greece to the US Civil War. And I think a link between the way Schlosser describes the Trojan War as a sort of devastation, sort of mass destruction, that challenged, basically devastated people's ability to imagine what's next. The Civil War is right up there. The Civil War was an instance of industrialized and sort of anonymous killing on a mass scale that outstripped society's ability to name, bury, grieve, and mourn its dead. Now, again, we're in a largely Protestant context, so I just want to mark that quickly. And so whatever society thought it was doing, that was the frame for doing it. And the political stakes were extremely high during the Civil War, being that the future of the nation state was precisely at issue, and the ability of each side to mount a military offensive. You have to keep morale, you have to keep the people invested, especially a Civil War. You have to keep the everyday people invested in the war. If they withdraw, which is what happened to the Confederacy, Southerners withdrew their support from the military, and that's just one reason why they lost. But it's very, very important in Civil War for the populace to be invested in in the effort. And in the Protestant context, the ideal of a good death, that is that you're surrounded by family, you're at home, you're sort of spiritually in line with a process where you are going to be forgiven your sins and go to heaven. That's a good death in the Protestant and Christian model. It had to be kind of reconfigured during the Civil War to allow soldiers to have at least a decent burial. So at least that you would be identified, your next of kin would be notified, that your body would be, again, buried at least decently, marked in a marked grave, ideally with a coffin to protect the body from the elements and from animals and so forth. So it became an imperative for each country to provide a decent burial for soldiers. In so doing, certain innovations in burial practices emerged that, interestingly enough, blurred the line between the living and the dead, notably through embalming. Now, one might say that in the Christian paradigm, the theology is around eternal life, and so maybe life and death are on more of a continuum than a sharp rupture. We can talk theology when we see each other, but these kinds of demarcations between the living and the dead, between the soldier and the family, became very charged and very momentous during war. And I think it's very interesting. I think Fal's point about not just embalming, but also photography, which is why I've selected this image to accompany this discussion, that photography played a very special role. And there were different photographic technologies in play at the time to make real what was happening around people, because what was happening around people was sort of unprecedented, where there were battles in which tens of thousands of people were killed. And this is just a huge and rapid, like in 3 days, 20,000 men would be killed. I mean, this is just a scale and pace of death that was kind of shell shock to mix metaphors with World War I. And so embalming, photography were, and the creation of the first national cemetery in 1862 and 5 memorialization sites. These are some of the innovations to make real, to help people grasp the reality that was sort of outstripping their culture's ability to process. And again, what is the democratic in all of this? Well, it's the idea that if the government gets its legitimacy from the people, it gets its power based on the consent of the governed, then the dead also have some claims on government, right? And the descendants and the survivors also have a claim on government to respectfully deal and reckon with the dead, with the bodies that the war took away, the lives that the war took away. Again, highly gendered situation. Of course, most of the soldiers were men, not all. There were about 400 women who infiltrated the army, passed the physicals, and who passed as men. So, but overwhelmingly biological men who identified as such dominated the ranks of the soldiers. And then on the home front, although the line there was blurred too between battlefield and home front, the work of mourning was largely allocated to women. So again, gender and the embodied experience, very, very important in death and mourning. And so that's question of emplacement, right? Civil War, boy, it happens in a place. It happens in a place, and for many, especially of course on the southern side of the Mason-Dixon line, it happened in people's backyards and in their fields and in their barnyards and in their gardens. And so place is very, very important. And so there's some places became invested with special, even sacred, and I think over time, iconic value for democracy, right? So the story of democracy takes place in a specific locale that then comes to be a reference point for, it's a pedagogical moment, right? It's a teachable, literally a teachable moment for how is it that we live in a democracy? How does one proceed if this is who we're trying to be? So places like Gettysburg and the death of Lincoln, the shooting of Lincoln, as occasions for consecrating, for grounding, for using language that resonates about democracy itself, about democracy's value and its purpose. So, and important restatements of the goals of the war, especially for the Union side, but in its own way for the Confederacy as well. So again, emplacement, very, very important for understanding how death, mourning, and grief are tied to a polity, a democratic polity in this case. Okay, and so I just put a few images. You may have read the Faust either in hard copy at the library or via the PDFs online, but just we have a photographic record of the Civil War, and also an artistic record. There's lots of evidence, there's lots of images, and so I just thought I'd bring some of those forward because I think technology figures, right, in practices of death, grief, and mourning, and the legacies thereof, and of course the pedagogy, the teachable moments, if you will, about democracy. So on the left we have the Confederate painting about the breath of Vanité that Faust refers to by William Washington. And here we see on the left-hand side sort of enslaved workers scripted into mourning the death of the master. We see, I think, a female figure presiding over the burial, which again is kind of gender non-normative, right? It's wartime, so people are improvising. And of course, her literacy is notable, right, in this instance. And then the other thing I think is striking is on the right-hand side, we see a pregnant spouse. Very unusual to see pregnancy rendered in quite this way in sort of the fine arts, if you will, in the 19th century, which is not to say pregnant women weren't painted, but their profiles were rarely, if ever, emphasized in this way. And of course, here we're back to this notion of hope and the Trojan women and the future and babies and cradling and gender and, life and death, right? So there's that. And it's just nice to see it in color. It just gives a little more dimensionality. The top of the page, very, very, again, iconic in the sense that vested with intense teaching and learning around the meaning of democracy. This is called the Identified Union Soldier and Family. It's held by the Library of Congress. And we see husband, wife, and 2 children. Husband, I feel fairly confident saying rather proudly posed, right, with wearing the Union Army uniform, and the family kind of turned out in their best, right? The beautiful bonnets, the girls in the matching jackets and hats. I mean, this is a very, very resonant image, and yet very mysterious, because we know that enslaved people and recently emancipated people had limited resources, although this might have been a little bit more prosperous family, limited resources to preserve records of their lives, and certainly photography. So it's got a lot of mystery around it, as well as a lot of again, hope and promise for democracy despite hideous institutional racism then and now. And then at the bottom, it was nice to be reminded in the Faust of the elaborate funeral procession and memorialization of Lincoln at the time. And I'd forgotten about the train, and the train traveled slowly from Washington back to Illinois, and there were many stops, and it was nice to be reminded. It was a good reminder to me about, again, the ways in which death, mourning, and memorialization provide these teachable moments about democracy and loss. Okay, so just to kind of round the corner here and bring the in-placeness into the 21st century, we have two essays. Hopefully you've read at least one of them, about 9/11 and the attack on the Twin Towers in Lower Manhattan. And in the Young essay, I think this is the grad only piece, but it's worth I think recuperating, because like Lincoln's death, like the soldiers' deaths during the Civil War, emphasizing a little bit more the Union side in that instance, that loss is an opportunity for a public pedagogy around democracy. And so the Young essay really is structured through these binary contrasts that I highlighted at the beginning of my remarks. Young's discussion of the memorial is structured through stark binaries, one having to do with absolutism versus democracy, the understanding that, although I don't, the understanding, rightly or wrongly, that Al-Qaeda is the expression of an absolutist worldview or political theory versus democracy. And also this idea of ruins versus regeneration. So this idea that Young articulates very strongly that Americans, unlike perhaps Europeans, don't define themselves by their ruins and their ancient buildings, but by building new ones. And so that this was a person who actually was on the committee to evaluate the proposals for the memorial that was finally opened, I think it was 10 years after the incident. But this idea that building something new was very American and very, much about democracy as something new, as something sort of old, but regenerated in modern terms. Young also talks about, this is kind of a public history, this memorial is kind of a public history project. And so our question of collaboration is salient, and Young acknowledges that public memory is necessarily a negotiated process. And this is, again, a kind of democratic, teachable moment. It's not top down, it's not one way only, that it is, has to be able, that the memorial, he argued, had to embrace, quote, a worldview that allows for competing and even conflicting agendas. Yeah, sorry. So in other words, the memorial process itself had to practice democracy, right? Had to embrace equality and multiple perspectives. Young made a point of saying there's no hierarchy of victim groups. In some ways, the victims were, very, very simplistically, the victims didn't have distinguishing uniforms on, but the firefighters and police did. So I remember the firefighters and police being sort of easier to identify, but there was a lot of attention to not heroicize, right, the first responders. And we can talk about, if you go there, we talk about if that happened or not. So again, Young describes the process of deciding, of soliciting and choosing a memorial plan as having to model something about democracy. The piece also hits a couple of chords from important parts of our course that I've outlined today, like places are made sacred through tragic loss. So again, place is very important. And then I think we're going to have to keep coming back to this notion of tragedy. This is tragic. What makes something tragic? I'm in process with this word. Is it tragic because it should have been avoidable? Is it tragic because it's unavoidable? Open question around the category tragedy. I thought it was also interesting, the Young piece, that the planners of the memorial, and it's the winning design is pictured on the right, Reflecting Absence by Michael Arad and Co. and his company. I thought it was interesting that the commission to choose the design very clearly was like, whatever we do is going to join something they refer to as a national memorial matrix. In other words, it's not coming out of nowhere. It's going to be in dialogue, right, with other historic points, with other special consecrated places in the landscape. And the Young essay mentions the Holocaust Remembrance site that is in Manhattan, as well as the Statue of Liberty. which I think are really interesting and kind of international sites, if you will, one marking immigration, one marking incidents that happened in World War II. And yet the National Native American Museum is down the street from the 9/11 memorial space, and it's not mentioned in this. So in other words, the United States as a beacon for immigrants, the United States as winner of World War II is noted, but the United States as colonizer of North America, as noted in the Native American Museum in Lower Manhattan, I mean, literally blocks away, is not mentioned. So that's, seems to me, a strategic silence here. I want to interrogate. And again, teachable moment that the commission is very clear that this moment of loss is a somewhat agonistic moment to reconsecrate, that people should reconsecrate themselves to democracy, to strengthen our resolve to protect freedom and inspire, oops, a typo, inspire an end to hatred, ignorance, and intolerance. So it was very interesting to read this. It was nice to be reminded. I actually worked in Two World Trade for a while in the 80s. And I remember that day. I was here, but I remember that day. Okay. And I've also been to the memorial, so I can share some things about that as we're not done with this topic, but maybe some of you have visited as well. So there's some things to share. And then just finally, I believe the shared reading was this Paleowitz intro to the securitization of memorial sites. And what this group of folks is arguing, you know, some 20 years or 15 years after Young and the commission sort of rolls out its plans for the site, is that this call to reconsecrate to democracy doesn't look necessarily as it might have. That in fact, what the reconsecration to democracy has spawned in the wake of 9/11 is both the securitization of the site as almost like a military installation, a kind of even prison, in one reference. And also, of course, the securitization of the entire United States, especially around airports and the waging of war, right, in Iraq and the chase for al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. So the argument here in general is that the museum and memorial have reinforced insecurity by installing a securitized campus around the space. By, and I'm being a little bit informal here to make the point, by basically scaring people and fostering a state of mourning without end. And they suggest that by scaring people and creating a state of mourning without end, it makes the population, i.e. citizens, vulnerable to accepting aggressive counterterrorism. In other words, the main lesson from 9/11 is not build a better democracy, but build better counterterroristic policing and military practices. So what they propose to help dig out of this is because the logic of foreign relations, because the logic of military and diplomatic traditions is both one, they're very insulated from everyday people. We do get to vote for Congress people and senators who vote on this sort of thing, but it's one of the more remote areas of our society. It's hard to get a hold of for everyday people. And because it's an elite discourse and these institutions that make these decisions are closed. I mean, not entirely closed, but really gatekept, right? The authors propose, what do we do? Like, so how do we break in? Well, they propose, and this is where collaboration and public history come in, a practice they call participatory critical rhetoric, PCR, that instead of talking about ideas and power, to talk about everyday objects. That if we gather around objects, they call, instead of realpolitik, they talk about Dingpolitik. I don't speak German or haven't studied it, so I might not be saying that right. That by talking about sort of simple everyday objects that remind us, that are associated with events, right, with important momentous events, we can begin to open up the otherwise unquestioned counterterrorism frame around the museum and the memorial, and around, other aspects, presumably around other aspects of our society that are closed, kind of gate kept and closed spaces. So what they suggest is that PCR and Dingpolitik can help engender an alternative, quote, ecology of memory and mourning, that it can accommodate multiple logics and the very entangled emplotments involved in any major human incident or conflict, and 9/11 being, emblematic and instructive in that regard. So, yeah, so just to bring it full circle, we have a quote from Virgil, very important Roman writer, pictured. So again, the presence of the ancients in our contemporary life is salient to flag here. No day shall erase you from the memory of time. So I'm really curious about what you make of that phrase, and we'll talk about it maybe when we get back together. And then just a couple of images below from the memorial site. You got to scan in. It's kind of a gated community, and in fact, I was glad to be reminded that there was actually a case brought by the neighborhood association, Go Neighborhood Association, against basically the chief of police of New York City, saying that they were in violation of what was promised by the commission and the planning bureaus and all the people who had started this memorialization process, that they had way overstepped their bounds, that it felt like they were living in a police state in the neighborhood. It was no longer a neighborhood. It felt like a prison. And to quote from the case, they do not want a security campus in their neighborhood. And the case was dismissed. So I think it's an interesting point to inquire. We may want to challenge the security state, right? We may want to challenge counterterrorism, but it is not easy. It is not easy. So our democratic lesson making of the day, it's a steep climb. It's a steep climb. Okay. So that's sort of my quick overview of the reading and some of the most important points that maybe you can respond to in your papers. So, so just to kind of restate in a couple of different ways, that these could be prompts. Feel free to ignore, but these could be prompts. Does the tragic necessarily lend itself to the democratic? I mean, are tragic things necessarily democratic? Why or why not? There's this intense association in the reading, and is it convincing to you? I'm very curious to know what you think about that. What about connections between emotional style, or what the authors call the politics of affect, around mourning behaviors, around political outcomes, political ideology? I'm really curious about how you're beginning to navigate feeling, expression, collective expressions of feeling, and political social context. So, if mourning takes place in a democracy, here's another one, does that mean it's democratic? Can you have fascist mourning in a democracy? Can you have, what are we really saying here? What is the alignment between, ideology, kind of aspirational aspects of political life? Does the reading provide good examples? Does it provide counterexamples? What in your mind are some of the alignments around democratic practice and mourning behaviors? Pick a couple of examples, a couple of treatments from reading. That could make a great paper too. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, stay warm, and I will really look forward to seeing you next week. I'll expect you to upload your papers by midnight tonight. If you need some help, if you're having trouble getting online, if you've lost electricity, we will make accommodations. I'll give you some good feedback, and also just try to reach out over email. And if you want to maybe try to meet over Zoom, or I'll try to meet your needs for support, for intellectual support, best I can this week. I'm hopefully planning to be back on campus, I don't know, tomorrow? I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen, but certainly by Thursday. So here's some extra sources that I cited in my remarks today. You're not responsible for them, but I always like to have my last slide be my sources cited. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.